Have you ever watched a movie and thought, what the hell is happening? Did I just fall asleep and miss an hour?
Welcome to the future. Welcome to the crime zone. A wasteland of weirdos, psychos, and freaks, where sex has become the greatest commodity, and it's controlled by the state.
Those are the rules.
Crime Zone, a 1988 Roger Corman production shot entirely in Peru without saying a lick of Spanish, starring David Carradine, a man who 2 years prior was nominated for a Golden Globe for Best Supporting Actor in a TV show, North and South. But Carradine plays our cigar-chomping police chief in a dystopian future city. Opposite of Carradine are our two leads, Peter Nelson, a up-and-coming star, star is a stretch. His most well-known work at that time was mainly as a supporting character in the V TV miniseries and V The Last Battle. The other star was Cheryl Fien, a woman who would be nominated for a Golden Globe and an Emmy 2 years later for her role on Twin Peaks. Wow. Fien on her way up and Carradine on his way down. Crime Zone, though, is a movie about a mysterious stranger who recruits young lovers who are engaged in an illicit romance to commit a crime spree in a futuristic police state, while promising them an avenue for escape. That's a pretty interesting concept. What was more interesting is how they removed an hour and a half out of the runtime and said, yes, this is great.
Crime Zone.
Sadly, there's no real behind-the-scenes story for Crime Zone, no production diaries, no interviews, no making-of featurettes, nothing. If this movie ever had a production Bible, it's probably being used to level a table. But what I can tell you, and what's probably actually more interesting, is the history leading up to the movie. Why it was made in Peru, how Roger Corman ended up there, why Luis Loza became his guy, and what happened to our famous director afterwards.
Famous?
Yes, famous!
In 1983, Roger Corman sold his ownership of New World Films and started a new film label, Millennium Films, before relabeling it at the end of 1983 to New Horizons, which he would also then relabel to Concord Films in 1985. Anyways, after his sale of New World, he agreed to consult and give them 5 movies, which he did, but at the same time, he was starting with some real money, which meant he could give people the more bang, but because it was his buck, he needed to make sure that they stayed cheap. So, in 1983, after selling New World, Roger Corman began his great expedition into Latin America to find the cheapest market with the hungriest filmmakers. Corman's first stop was Argentina, a country trying to reintroduce itself to the world after the Falklands War and the fall of its military junta. For a few years, it was perfect: cheap labor, eager crews, and a government desperate for foreign investment. But as the country stabilized, unions reformed, regulations tightened, and production costs crept upward, Corman had to leave. By the late 1980s, Argentina was no longer a bargain it had been, and Corman quietly wound down operations there, ending entirely by 1990. But in 1987, Corman, who was already off looking for other places after Argentina started to get a little too rich for him, was tipped off by his producer, Livia Anatola, that he realized that Argentina had a neighbor that was in far worse shape and therefore far better suited to his brand of low-budget exploitation filmmaking.
We are off to Peru.
Peru was dealing with communist insurgencies, cocaine war, violence spilling into the countryside, and it too was also dealing with a post-junta government presiding over a stagnating economy. In other words, the exact conditions where Corman production could stretch a dollar the farthest. And so he began the Peruvian decade, the era that would eventually give us Crime Zone. Back in 1987, Anatola showed Corman a few episodes of the Peruvian TV series Gamboa and asked if he saw any other directors who could make a tiny budget look like a real movie. And that's how he discovered Luis Loza. At the time, Loza had directed hundreds of episodes of Peruvian television, IMDb list over 450, mostly for the telenovela Carmen, and he was one of the few local directors pushing Peruvian TV toward more ambitious cinematic production. Corman called him directly, offered him a classic Corman budget, which was still more money than Lalosa had ever seen at once, and gave him roughly 6 weeks to deliver a finished feature. Lalosa accepted, and the result was Hour of the Assassin, or as it was released in Peru, Misión a los Andes. The movie was a Roger Corman exploitation film. It wasn't meant to be great, but a binge and forget film. But in Peru, its impact was enormous. Not because it was good, it wasn't, but because it was one of the first films a Hollywood production had been shot in Peru with Peruvian crews. Over 1 million Peruvians saw it in theaters, which was roughly about 5% of the country at the time. It didn't make blockbuster money, but it proved something far more important. Peruvians would show up for films made in Peru. It was the spark that hinted at the future Peruvian film industry. Corman knew Peru had a real market, a hungry one, a country that had just proved it would show up for films made on its own soil. But what followed was a slow drift away from anything recognizably Peruvian. Starting with Crime Zone, the cast became increasingly American. The scripts arrived exclusively in English, and Peru's locations were stripped down of their culture. The country became a cheap backdrop. Lalosa didn't fight this. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he didn't want to. It was the price of admission into the Corman system, and he paid it. Lalosa eventually outgrew Corman, moving through his own company, Iguana Films, towards Hollywood proper with Sniper, The Specialist, and Anaconda. And then Anaconda happened. The film was a critical disaster, and Hollywood has a long memory for that kind of failure. But the door didn't just close because of bad reviews. By the mid to late 1990s, the economics that had made Peru an attractive filming destination were collapsing from multiple directions at once. Alberto Fujimori's regime had turned the country into a byword for political instability. Canada and Australia were also aggressively courting productions with tax incentives, and American states were following suit. And CGI was beginning to make location shooting feel optional in ways it never had before. Peru, once Corman's bargain, was now nobody's first call. Hollywood didn't need it anymore, and after Anaconda, they didn't need Lalosa either. Which left Lalosa caught between two worlds with no footing in either. The Peruvian critical establishment had already written him off. His films were international, commercial, and made in English. And by the definitions that mattered to the gatekeepers of national cinema, that made them not Peruvian at all. When asked in 2007 whether he considered himself a Peruvian director, Lalosa answered with some uncomfortable honesty, quote, "I am Peruvian, but I have nothing to do with Peru." He framed it as a consequence rather than a choice. It wasn't a conscious decision. But the scholars who studied this period have pushed back on the neat separation. Misión en los Andes, whatever Corman's intentions was shot in Peru by Peruvian crews and seen by over 1 million Peruvians. Excluding it from national cinema tradition says less about the film than it does about how narrowly that tradition has been defined. But to end on a happy note, don't feel bad for Lalosa. He has had a massive success in producing tens of Peruvian TV shows with hundreds of episodes, returning to his roots pre-Corman, and, of course, every once in a while, still doing a Corman film, like Death Racer. Oh god, let's do this. In the futuristic police state of Soleil, the government sets up a criminal, Hector, who walks into a police trap. Hector is captured alive at the behest of the police chief and is executed live on television after a brief show trial. And a real show trial, too, which they should have leaned into, maybe not as far as Running Man, but a sweet spot like Hole in the Wall or Wipeout. Bone, a former security guard, who has recently lost his job at the cryogenics facility for not showing the proper respect to authority, how dare he fraternize, meets Helen, a woman forced into prostitution at the government-sanctioned brothel. Now, that's an interesting concept, not meaning a prostitute, but the other half. The government doesn't want the poor to breed, so they create a class society, and the ungraded class, the lowest tier called subgrade, aren't allowed to have relationships, and it's illegal for men to shack with women. So, that's interesting. They are immediately attracted to each other and begin a secret relationship as unauthorized romantic and sexual activity is illegal for lower-class subgrade citizens like themselves. Bone's friend, Creon, becomes jealous of their relationship and demands that Bone share Helen with him.
I mean, if I would have scored the bitch, I would have called up my old friend for a little piece of the action. JD2. I mean, that's the way it always used to be, Bone.
Disgusted, Bone refuses, and they eventually come to blows over Creon's behavior.
I'll kill you! Come on, right now!
One day, Bone and Helen, both disillusioned with Soleil's repressive society, steal some money from a supermarket. Saying both are disillusioned is a stretch. Bone is kind of dragged into the lifestyle by Helen, who seems to be getting off on the danger of being caught.
We can't do this. Why not?
But once given the chance to escape to a different life with Helen, Bones jumps on the bandwagon. They are observed by a mysterious man named Jason, first through the store window, then a dark alley behind a fence. I'm starting to get a little worried. But he offers them passage to Fordon, another nation at war with Soleil, in exchange for stealing records from a secure facility disguised as a hospital. Although suspicious of his offer, they accept and successfully deliver the information to Jason. Pause. I just want to say that they should have been tipped off that this was a booby trap after encountering like 2 guards for the whole facility. And the greatest obstacle they faced was a rotating drum that a hamster would have absolutely loved. But to prove my stance, just look how long it took them to get out of the facility that they just placed on high alert after they broke into the vault. Whoa, was that like 0 seconds? Anyways, Jason, after receiving the stolen records, attempts to delay their reward and talk them into further criminal acts. Frustrated and short on money, Bone and Helen rob a bank, quickly becoming the most wanted criminals in Soleil. Yeah, this was very confusing. I didn't quite understand why they accepted it. Well, I mean, now I do because of finances, but I don't know how much money they stole, because the only thing I saw them take was like a handful of coins. So not very successful, and they killed an innocent guy in the process. So Creon, though, attempts to blackmail Helen, but she dismisses his threats before Creon can attack her. Bone saves her, and he tells Creon that he would kill him if it wasn't for the fact that they were leaving Soleil so soon, which is what you should always tell your unstable friend who believes you're abandoning him for a woman.
You have no idea how badly I want to pull this trigger right now. And you know something? If I wasn't getting out of here, I wouldn't hesitate. I really wouldn't.
After losing faith in Jason's promises, Bone and Helen recruit their friends JD and Alexei to help them escape. The reasoning behind them losing faith in Jason is because they find out he's the chief of police and, some kind of police chief, and that he has created such a great police state society that he actually has created 0 criminals because he's just so good at his job. So he actually has to go out to create criminals to, I don't know, justify their budget. While on the run, Helen and Bone hide out in the so-called Plague Zone, where they encounter Jason, who is revealed to be a government agency. Jason explains that the government long ago ended any major crime in Soleil, and it is his job to recruit citizens to go on government-sponsored crime sprees that validate the powers of the police state. But this doesn't make sense. If the government solves crime, then wouldn't that mean that they can shape the people into any shape they want and the people will, accept because they solved crime? Which is something that I don't quite understand, because how did you solve crime if you disenfranchise huge swaths of your people? Like, I also don't understand why the plague victims would stay in the plague zone, or why this homeless guy would protect Helen and Bone. He just does. Helen and Bone briefly take Jason hostage, very briefly, then flee to a safer location where they discuss plans to rob wealthy citizens stored in the cryogenics facility and hijack a military helicopter that Alexei can pilot to Fordon. Creon bullies JD into betraying Bone and Helen to the police, with whom he has made a deal. Bone kills his former boss at the facility, and Creon tries to take Helen hostage. However, the police arrive and betray Creon, as Helen warned him they would.
Shoot it. Go ahead. Get out! Wait! Get out! What you said? I know what I said. Get the hell out of here. Go ahead.
Creon takes JD and Alexei hostage. When JD mocks him, Creon murders JD. Yep, and none of this is really justifiable. Like, Creon's descent isn't explained well. He should have been Bone and Helen's third gun for the bank scene or something. Like the best friend that spirals their crime wave into a deadly zone. Some would say a crime zone. But the biggest question was why Bone and his former boss hate each other in this scene. If you watch the movie from beginning to end, the boss doesn't hate Bone, but is disappointed that the guy should be like a grade 2 or 3 or whatever their ranking is, but he keeps sabotaging himself by being insubordinate.
And that's the way it will always be with you, Bone. You could have been third tier by now if you weren't so arrogant. Take the police, for instance. You're better material than half of the force, but they all know something you don't. How to play the game.
Doesn't hate him, just disappointed in him. At the military base, because Alexei is a pilot and somehow they just break into a military base to steal a helicopter, because apparently this is GTA 5. Helen and Bone, who managed to escape the facility ambush, set Alexei free and use Creon as a distraction while they steal a helicopter.
Open the hangar door. Now.
Creon begs to be taken with them, and this is right after shooting Bone, but they leave him behind for Jason to kill. Alexei flies Helen and Bone to Frodon, where they triumphantly land and celebrate their freedom. However, they discovered the area to be a deserted wasteland, and Jason is waiting for them. Jason, with his one police escort, orders his police escort to kill Alexei and then kills his police escort after they killed Alexei.
Sorry about your friend. Just business. Fucking business. Just business, my dear.
Jason reveals that the war with Frodon has been over for 20 years. The plague zone is in fact radioactive fallout from a destroyed Frodon that has drifted to Soleil. Due to Jason's knowledge of the truth, his position within the government is under threat, and the information stolen from the facility by Bone and Helen is his insurance. Since the state can only sustain itself so long as perceived threat of crime and war still exist, a crime and war that they have solved, he thanks them for fulfilling his plans and allow them to escape, returning to Soleil alone.
After all, there's always the threat that Helen and Bone might come back. And that's the best reason I can possibly think of for that inflated military budget. Don't you agree?
Bone and Helen, now free, walk along Frodon's coast, their future uncertain. But probably short, since they're walking in a nuclear wasteland that is Frodon, so. Now we're in the honest corner when it comes to this movie. Is Crime Zone good? No, not really. I try to review movies that are fun, entertaining, or at least special in that how was this made kind of way. This was one that has very little charm. The characters aren't great, and the acting is, well, the actors are physically present. But what I did enjoy was the way the movie made me feel. For most of the runtime, I was confused. Not lost, just baffled. I understood the plot and the motivations, but the execution, wow. Everything dominoes forward with almost no reasoning. Take Creon, for example. He suddenly becomes this horrible human being, or maybe he already was one. He kills a friend, he betrays another, all because he is rejected by our heroine. And up to this point, in the untold side of the story, that's just talked about in dialogue, he and his friend Bone have shared everything, including prostitutes. And then Bone draws the line in the sand, and this pushes Creon to a murderous level. The writing doesn't justify any of that. But if you go into a Roger Corman movie, though, trying to understand every little detail, you're just going to walk out with a headache. And that same logic applies to the world building. Why does the government need to create criminals? That's the one thing I can't wrap my head around, and it's central to the plot. Just like, why do they lie to their citizens and tell them that they're still at war? The people live in a subhuman conditions under a wealthy elite. Crime should happen naturally, but it doesn't. Everyone who hates their life just accepts it. They dream of escaping to a country that their own nation is at war with, yet they never rebel, they never steal, they never fight back, which is very odd because people who want to flee to a nation that they are at war with because that nation is better, usually they become a real issue for the police state. But the reasoning I can think of why this is so weird is it's a jumble of several different dystopian movies stitched together. You'll have people compare it to like Blade Runner, which also is, the story is very patchy, but it's a beautifully made movie. But it never asks the most basic question needed for the plot to make sense. They even introduce a relational hierarchy designed to keep subhumans from reproducing. And instead of exploring that with like surgeries or food or medicine, the movie just gives us state-sponsored prostitute vans. It's just so odd. And then when you come over to how desperate they are for criminals in order to prop up their police state, they allow their own officers to die unwarranted deaths just to execute these fake criminals on TV. And honestly, that would have been a more interesting movie. A cop loses his friend to a violent criminal only to discover the criminal is a state-sponsored thug who is killed on TV. And now he's hell-bent on exposing the truth. That would have been a more interesting movie. Wait, is that already a movie? Is that a Roger Corman movie? So the movie is full of plot points that are more interesting than the ones it actually focuses on. Everything around the edges hints at a better story. You shift the narrative a little to the left or to the right, and suddenly it's coherent. Hell, adding an hour, which goes against Corman's sacred 90-minute rule, probably would have fixed half the issues that feel like they were cut out. But hey, on the other side of the coin, the guy who wrote this also wrote Friday the 13th, Part 7. So, I'm not expecting a lot from the guy. I mean, just go take a glance at his credits. But here's the thing. Despite all the picking and prodding and head scratching, I did enjoy the movie. I enjoyed the frustration, the confusion, and the genuine interest it sparked by making me think about how easy it would be to fix this. It would be so easy. And there's not much else to talk about. I guess this is the end. So, you guys have a good one. Bye.